What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we got two sets of Tyranid datasheet spoilers from the new 9th edition codex in one 24-hour period. Let's get into it. In the previous version, I talked about Warriors of Tyranid Prime and the Gargoyle datasheets that have all been spoiled. Today we have a couple more datasheets that we saw the reference card for out of their instruction manuals, but we haven't seen the full datasheet with all of their abilities yet. And today we're going to be talking about the Horus, Swarmlord, and Winged Hive Tyrant that did just get leaked. Let's do it! Starting with the Horus, which is probably the least exciting of the three, or at the very least, the datasheet that's been the least changed. While I wasn't super excited about the Horus specs before looking at this datasheet, I'm actually a little bit more excited now. It's gone up to 15 wounds with a 2+ armor save, which obviously very strong, especially against small arms fire. And we can also see its weapon special abilities now. So it does have that Grasping Tongue, which used to be D3 damage, now becomes a flat 3 damage, and instead of being able to shoot into or out of combat, similar to the Venom Thrope rule, can now ignore Lookout Sir, since I guess he's trying to grab characters out of units. I understand. It makes sense. Now, importantly, the Ravenous Maw attack is probably the most changed out of the 3 weapon profiles on this guy's datasheet. It's gone from being D3 attacks per attack used with the weapon to a flat 3, meaning that with its stat line of 5 attacks on its profile, if it puts all of them into its Ravenous Maw, it makes a total of 15 attacks. With its base ballistic skill of 3, that's actually a pretty big deal. That's a lot of 2 damage swings that you can be making with this guy. Alternatively, it does have those Shoveling Claws, which are now Strength 14, no longer bracketing on Strength at all, EP3 for D3 plus 3 damage. That's a very fine profile. It's a classic sort of Redemptor Dreadnought style profile. I think I'm more excited about the 15 little attacks out of this guy. That's kind of almost a knight level of melee output, especially at that base 3+ weapon skill. It's much more exciting than the old 4+ or 5+ weapon skill that you saw in the previous version. We do also have its datasheet abilities here, and unfortunately, we have some missing from the Horus specs, or at least some rules text that it had previously had. First off, it had the Acid Blood ability. That's no longer on its datasheet, but it does have the Acid Blood keyword, which is probably going to be a stratagem that you use when you take damage. In the fight phase, you can reflect mortal wounds back onto somebody. I imagine. I have no idea, but I would hope so. Importantly, speaking of keywords, it does also have the Horned Chitin keyword, which a lot of the other monsters that we're going to talk about in this spoiler also share, and it does not have the core keyword. So it's looking so far like the big monsters will probably be lacking that core keyword, which means a lot of the interesting synergies that Tyranids had for large monsters will probably have been removed, and these monsters will mostly be acting on their own just with stratagem support and not with the Synaptic Link abilities that we're seeing some of these characters pick up. Now, the Rapacious Hunger ability on its datasheet used to be the one that would allow it to make additional attack with its claws after it killed a model with its maw. That would allow you to set up interesting combos where it would sink into a tank and a group of infantry, kill the infantry, and use those to fuel attacks onto the tank. You can no longer do that. Now you just make your attacks as normal, which, to be fair, saves a lot of time and confusion, but is also, just way worse. It has no way of generating additional attacks. It's just going to be making its 5 attacks on its profile. That is, to be fair, more in every situation than it made in the previous version, but that's obviously less exciting. Fortunately, its healing ability is significantly better. It now regains a lost wound each time an enemy model is destroyed. It's not just to check whether or not an enemy model was destroyed to regain a wound. Previously, if you killed 10 enemy models in the fight phase, you would only regain 1 wound at the end of the fight phase. Now you regain those wounds immediately. Each time every individual model is destroyed, you just regain them to a maximum of 3. It also has this terrible leadership affecting ability, which we're really not going to care about. Importantly, we can also see that Death Throes has been changed. It now is a more classic vehicle explosion, 6 inches for D3 mortal wounds. If we see stratagems like Animated by the Hive Mind remain legal, this extra distance on the Death Throes ability is actually going to be a pretty big deal. And we'll probably see a lot more mortal wounds dealt on the opposing army as a result of these monsters freaking out when they die. Anyway, let's move on to the Hive Tyrant. This is probably the one that promised the most to change. Now, we can see here that a lot of the profiles that we got from that reference sheet are intact. So we can see we have the Heavy Venom Cannon, Stranglethorn Cannon, Monstrous Bone Sword. All in here, Lash Whip gives that same reroll effect that we saw on the Tyranid Warrior datasheet, where it rerolls hit rolls of 1 if you're equipped with 1. It also has access to adrenal glands and toxin sacs. No flesh hooks for this guy, just those 2. just like the Tyranid warriors, and those effects are the same. So Toxin Sass gives it a Gene Rot Might effect, where hit rolls of 6 automatically wound. Adrenal Glands gives it +1 move and +1 strength. Both of those effects are very good. That actually brings us up to an impressive 17-inch move and strength 8, which is a dizzying height of strength that Hive Tyrants have really never achieved before. I'm very proud of this guy. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about the Flying Hive Tyrant because this guy's profile, at least on the reference sheet, has been pretty weird. When you build the Hive Tyrant kit, one of the hard points on the body gets taken up by the wings, but in the previous version of the Codex, the wings were just an ancillary upgrade and didn't take up one of those weapon slots, which meant that you were left with sort of one less slot for your weapons than the Foot Hive Tyrant would have, even though mechanically you could take the same number when you built your list in the game. Its base loadout is a monstrous bone sword and lash whip, but it also has this secondary weapon, the Tyrant Talons. Now, I actually really like this. This is pretty cool. The Tyrant Talons are a strength user, so strength 7 in this case goes up to strength 8 if you have equipped Adrenal Glands, AP 3, 1 damage attack. You make 2 additional attacks with that weapon every time you fight. This is basically the chainsword rule, which means that regardless of your loadout, you will make your 5 base attacks with whatever melee weapon you have this guy equipped, then also 2 Tyrant Talons. Those are not the only attacks you have to make with that, though. So if you equipped a big gun, like a heavy venom cannon or a stranglethorn cannon, you can make your base 5 attacks with the Talons, plus 2 additional because of the weapon special rule. Meaning that this guy is coming out every single time with at least 7 attacks. I have no idea whether or not these Talons are going to be included in the Foot Hive Tyrant profile. I actually have a sneaking suspicion that they won't be, which means that the Winged Hive Tyrant becomes a very different animal from the Foot Hive Tyrant. The Foot Hive Tyrant is going to be slower and more heavily armored, as we saw in the reference sheet, but is going to have different access to melee weapons. You'll most likely have the option to take multiple sets of melee weapons on the Foot Hive Tyrant, but overall, I imagine the Winged Hive Tyrant will end up having more attacks because of this Tyrant Talon profile. Now, when the reference sheet was spoiled, the Monstrous Scything Talon profile was one that confused me and made me believe that it had some sort of additional attack mechanic, and it does. It has the same additional attack mechanic that the Warrior Scything Talons have in the datasheets that we talked about earlier today. Each time you fight, you make 1 additional attack with each Monstrous Scything Talon that you have. You can only take them in pairs of 2, which means that you'll at the very least be making 2 additional attacks with your Monstrous Scything Talon. This means that a Winged Hive Tyrant with that Scything Talon loadout makes an absolute boatload of attacks. It has its 5 base attacks that you're going to be attacking with its Scything Talon with. Then, on top of that, it has 2 additional attacks from the Scything Talon rule. It still has Tyrant Talons, so you then make 2 additional attacks with the Tyrant Talons as well. There's so many Talons in this. This brings it to a grand total of 9 attacks, 7 of them at 2 damage, the rest at 1 damage. That actually means that taking Toxin Sacs to automatically wound on 6s is pretty good with this guy, because the more attacks you make, the greater chance you have to automatically wound with them. That said, Adrenal Glands always going to be good on these Winged Hive Tyrant variants because they're probably going to be trying to get into melee, and +1 move is very good at doing that. Now, the Lash Whip ability is also good. You do get access to that Strength 10, potentially Strength 11 if you have Adrenal Glands, Monstrous Bone Sword that comes in at 3 damage. Again, if you have that loadout, you're going to make 5 attacks with the Bone Sword, then 2 attacks with the Talons on top of that. And the Lash Whip will give you reroll once to hit, as well as the Lash Whip keyword, which will probably have some sort of fight last stratagem associated with it. Interestingly, the Prehensile Pincer Tail is no longer a separate weapon like it is on the current version of the Tyrant, which I actually love. The Pincer Tail is always terrible. Sometimes you forget to make it. A lot of times you have to make it and sequence it correctly so that you can try to maximize the damage you do. But at a relatively low strength and AP 0, it never really did anything. Your opponent would always just save, and the extra effort you went through to try to make your melee attacks efficient was totally lost. In this case, this effect is actually really nice. It gives you essentially a Master Artisan's reroll. You reroll 1 hit roll or wound roll whenever you fight. Easy peasy, we're done. Well, I think it'll be an interesting question whether or not the Winged Hive Tyrants see play. I think if we retain access to an effect like Murderous Size to be able to upgrade their Monstrous Scything Talons to do more damage, I think Winged Hive Tyrants are going to be absolutely phenomenal because of the boatload of attacks that they make at that long threat range. If not, they might be dead. I don't know. We'll find out. It really depends on a lot of stuff. They are coming in at 11 power, so we're probably around the 200 to 220 point level here, so a little bit more than they are currently, actually. But they do have some really interesting new abilities. First off, we see Will of the Hive Mind, which is essentially the new, I guess, kind of synaptic link that Hive Tyrants are going to be bringing. A lot of these Tyranid creatures so far have almost a direct analog to Space Marine. Hive Tyrants are your Space Marine captains. They give you a reroll 1s. The difference, just like Tyranid Primes are your lieutenants that give you a reroll 1s to wound. The difference is that instead of being a persistent aura, these are these targeted synaptic link effects where you pick a core unit in synaptic link range in order to assume direct control and give them those rerolls. I actually like this ability quite a bit, especially since, assuming the synaptic link rules remain the same, Hive Tyrants will actually be able to range out pretty far and still be able to support your army as long as you can chain their effects back to them. One problem with the current implementation of Tyranids is that a lot of their command phase effects are on a base aura from your own unit. So you can imagine like Swarm Leader from the Hive Fleet Leviathan supplement is 9-inch range, pick something, it gets rerolls, but if you ever leave that, they'll never get it again. Now, if you're able to maintain your synaptic link chain back to your units that you want to be giving rerolls to, you can maintain those rerolls throughout subsequent turns as long as the Hive Tyrant remains alive, which is frickin' sick. This is going to be even more impactful as we talk about the next datasheet that was spoiled. Now, interestingly as well, it has the Death from Above ability built into the datasheet. And one thing that some people pointed out in the last video that I talked about gargoyles in is that they've actually lost the ability to innately deep strike. It looks like the Hive Tyrant is going to be keeping that ability, and at the same time, the turn that it comes in, it automatically rerolls its charge rolls, meaning that while it doesn't get any bonuses to charge, unfortunately, from adrenal glands anymore, it now has that reroll built in, which means its charges out of Deep Strike aren't quite as bad as they were previously. I'm still most likely going to be setting this guy up on the table and moving him around, but it is nice to know that there is some redundancy if he does decide to Deep Strike. He's also a Psyker in almost exactly the way that he's a Psyker currently. He has 2 casts, 1 deny from the Hive Mind Discipline. We don't know what that looks like, but we do know it is on page 69 of the Codex, which is very nice, including the return of the Horned Chitin keyword that we just talked about with the Horus specs datasheet. And with that, let's move on to the big kahuna of these spoiled datasheets. That's right, it's the big man himself, the Swarmlord. Now, we've seen a lot of the Swarmlord stats in those spoiled reference cards, and so a lot of that's going to be the same. He does go up to toughness 8, he has a base strength of 8, his strength no longer degrades, instead his weapon skill, ballistic skill, will degrade slightly as he loses wounds, but that's going to be a little bit tougher because he did go up a wound to 13 from 12, and he went up an armor save. Now, besides that, almost everything else in this datasheet is different than the previous version, and to be fair, I think that is to be expected. If anyone thought that Hive Commander was going to remain in the new Codex in the same form that it did in the 8th edition Codex, you were deluding yourselves, because there is no way that that ability was sticking around. Unlike the other Tyranid characters that we've talked about so far, Swarmlord has essentially 2 synaptic links. The first one is Hive Commander, like we talked about, which confers objective secured to the Hive Fleet core unit that you pick within synaptic link range, and if it's already objective secured, it counts as double. If Tyranids become a truly horde army, you can tell that this is going to be absolutely ludicrous once you start talking about large units of Termagants or Hormagaunts. Throwing 30 models on an objective and all of them counting as double is going to be absolutely insane. If the Hive Fleet Leviathan supplement remains in play as well, you could potentially triple obsec a unit, which sounds pretty silly. Domination of the Hive Mind is the Swarmlord's other ability, and this is probably the actual replacement for Hive Commander. It's basically an upgraded version of the regular Hive Tyrant's Will of the Hive Mind, and instead of giving them reroll 1s to hit, it gives them full rerolls to hit, full stop. Swarmlord is the chapter master of the Tyranids. Blade Parry has also changed. It no longer gives Swarmlord a 3+ invulnerable save in melee, instead reducing the damage characteristic of the first saving throw that he fails against the melee attack to 0. This is, unfortunately for him, significantly worse than the 3+ invulnerable save, because the 3+ invulnerable save ends up being more consistent and doesn't really give your opponent the ability to play around it. You can imagine a situation where your opponent tries to get in an attack with a Misericordia, or an offhand weapon, or a regular Mook that's in melee with the Swarmlord, in order to force that Blade Parry activation to trigger on a 1 damage attack before then going in with their big 3 damage attacks. There are going to be situations where the Swarmlord gets to Blade Parry like a 6 damage swing from a knight or something, and it's going to be awesome, but I highly doubt that it's going to happen particularly often. While that is pretty unfortunate for Swarmlord, it does look like he's going down some significant points. He's currently at 240, but at 11 power level, again, he's probably going to be in that somewhere around 200 to 220 point range. Now, is he good? I don't know. I think all of these datasheets look a little bit worse than their 8th edition versions. The Horus specs obviously is a little bit of a glow up, but that model was unplayably terrible to begin with, so that's not saying too much. I do think that the Flying Hive Tyrant is certainly an interesting change, and at the very least a side grade. And if we do see, like I said before, any damage increasing effects, the Flying Hive Tyrant might just still be incredible and a very powerful melee threat. The Swarmlord, however, losing his big signature ability and turning into a regular chapter master, while definitely to be expected, is pretty unfortunate. I like moving stuff twice. That said, there is a rumor going around that the Hive Commander ability, or something similar to it that allows an out-of-activation movement, has become a stratagem in the Tyranid Codex, and that the Swarmlord unlocks either cheaper use or more frequent use of that stratagem. And if that's the case, I'm pretty excited about it. We'll have to see what the entirety of the codex looks like. Obviously, these datasheets are wildly different than the previous version, so we can't really jump to any conclusions about them. But I am excited to see how they do synergize with the remainder of the faction. We can see some very hefty stat line increases, especially on the Swarmlord's part, and even on the Winged Hive Tyrant as well. And again, any force multiplication effects that hit these things are going to make them even that much better. Anyway, that's all I have to say for today, folks. Thanks for watching all of the Tyranid content that I've been making. I'm going to take a nap now. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.